Hello and welcome to Infowars Nightly News with me, your host, Paul Joseph Watson, on this Thursday, February 23rd edition. Now, I'm delighted to welcome to the show this evening Dr. Michael Coffman, Ph.D., scientist, ecologist, involved in ecosystem research for both science and industry for over 20 years. Many of you, of course, will know him from Alex Jones' documentary Endgame, and his website is discerningtoday.org. Dr. Coffman, welcome to Infowars Nightly News.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be with you.
Well, let's get straight to the heart of the matter, which, of course, is Agenda 21. We've got the big 20th anniversary of Rio coming up. Tell the viewers about Agenda 21. How does it manifest itself today? And how will it affect our lives if we don't stand up and resist it?
Well, your listeners are probably aware that it's a 40-chapter document that was brought out and signed by President Bush in 1992 at the Rio de Janeiro Summit, Earth Summit. And basically, those 40 chapters cover everything that humanity does as it interacts with the environment in some form or another, plus some other things like women's rights and that type of thing. It really is a very comprehensive effort. It is soft law. It doesn't have any teeth or legal teeth to it, but they do have what is known as the Covenant on the Environment and Development in the wings. It's a treaty that will be a hard law. In other words, it will have penalties if you do not do it. So as a consequence, it is a potentially very dangerous type of agreement that uses a socialistic philosophy to basically develop what's called global governance. It is the heartbeat of what we call global governance. It will really allow government to manifest itself in everybody's life on a very, very minor, basically a very detailed level. There is no one that can escape this, assuming they want to come down on you. And of course, as a consequence, we are going to have, I think, a lot of trouble if this thing ever gets fully implemented.
Now, of course, one of the key facets of this is so-called sustainable development. I mean, every time I turn on the television, whether it be the news or indeed commercials, I constantly hear this word sustainable or sustainability. Dr. Coffman, when we hear that word, what is the true meaning behind the phrase sustainability as it relates to Agenda 21?
Well, there's two levels. One is the public level, where we're not supposed to do anything that would cause damage to future generations. And the other is more spiritual in its nature. It's occultish in its nature. It believes and it's based upon the fact that nature is God, and therefore we must do things that will not harm God. That is a very, very powerful concept, and it's one that drives the whole sustainable development agenda behind Agenda 21. It's not necessarily what you see on the surface, that you just don't want to do things that are going to cause harm in the future. It literally is that you can no longer do anything that they perceive causes harm to Mother Nature. And that is a very restrictive type of concept of sustainable development, one that's guaranteed to destroy property rights, one that's guaranteed to destroy basically many of the freedoms that we have around in the Western world. And as a consequence, I think it's going to be, as we get into this, as more and more of this is revealed, going to be very, very dangerous. It's going to be harder and harder to stop it the longer it goes and the deeper it gets itself entrenched into our law.
Now, you mentioned private property there. I know that is a key aspect of this Agenda 21. I mean, what's amazing to me is these technocrats are so apparently hostile to the idea of private citizens owning property, and yet their own adherents, people like, Ted Turner and Prince Philip, own millions of acres of property themselves, and they have huge mansions all over the world, and yet they tell us via all these regulations, as you explained, that come with this environmental agenda, that it's somehow dirty for for us on the middle class scale to own any kind of property. So, I mean, could you just talk about that disconnect and that hypocrisy there with the elite that are behind this anti-property agenda?
You bet. It is one of the things that is very classically elitist in its nature. In other words, I can do what I want to do, but you cannot do anything because it'll be harmful. That is their attitude. It's actually in what is called the Global Biodiversity Assessment that I used to stop the ratification of the Convention on Biological Diversity on the U.S. Senate floor back in 1994. That particular portion of it, I don't have it in front of me right now, but basically extolled the virtues of the feudal system of Europe back when the nobility ruled over the peasants as the desirable form of government that would be established once it gets into place, which leads directly into the idea that the only one during that time that could own property were the elites, the nobility. And basically, they want to go back to that so that they can define exactly what happens on this land as if they knew better than we did how to use property. In fact, it's really kind of ironical that much of the damage that you've seen to the environment has been caused by the elite because they have no restrictions on them whatsoever, and not by the average person. And it's only until the average person owns their own property, uses it to make a living, that it usually gets protected because they need to protect it in order to continue to make a living generation after generation.
I mean, it's amazing. Prince Philip, also, of course, the front man of the World Wildlife Fund, and he's the guy, you know, back 20 years ago who was in Africa shooting tigers dead, and yet the charity people from the World Wildlife Fund still come knocking at your door begging for donations to save the tigers. When their very denizen, their head is the guy who is killing them in the hunts, in the safari. I mean, it's amazing, the hypocrisy. Also, you've got, of course,
hypocrisy is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, Prince Charles saying that you can't take a bath to save water.
Yeah.
It just illustrates, as you said, the hypocrisy and the fact that it's one rule for them and another rule for everybody else. Global warming, of course, this is again tied into Agenda 21, the environmentalist agenda. The latest data we've got came out a couple of weeks ago actually shows that the Himalayas and the nearby mountain peaks there in that region in China and along the border there, they've lost none of their ice over the last 10 years. And I mean, this stunned climate change proponents, of course. We've had Climate Gate, we've had Polar Bear Gate in recent years. We've had the failure at Copenhagen, the failure at Durban, and it really seems that the man-made global warming alarmists are on the ropes. I mean, Dr. Coffman, how close are we to actually pushing this back and collapsing the entire carbon tax agenda behind global warming, or do you think they'll just continue to push ahead with it despite all the opposition and evidence building against them?
They have to get control over the global economy. There is no other way that they can rule with global governance until they get control of the economy, especially that of the U.S. economy. And the easiest way of doing that is to use carbon credits and trading, as many of our pieces of legislation have attempted to do, but all of them have failed. The Environmental Protection Agency of the United States is now attempting to do this piecemeal, but the fact is they have to control our economy, and the easiest way of doing that is through scaring us to death with global warming. It's amazing, as you had indicated, how many things have fallen victim to the truth over the last 2 years especially, and it's actually accelerating now. More and more of their claims are being proven wrong, and yet all they do is increase the shrill of their scare stories and so forth, so that somehow that's going to cow us into submission to accept the horrifying draconian types of regulations that they have in mind. What most people may not realize fully, they understand it in general but don't understand it fully, is that there's a one-to-one relationship between energy and our civilization. We cannot have a healthy economy without cheap energy. And what we're experiencing here in the States is that our President Obama, is doing everything it can to stop all use of fossil fuel energy and replace it with alternative or clean fuel energy. That doesn't work, and it's very expensive. That way, they can control how we live, our standard of living. Actually, it will reduce our standard of living somewhere between 25 and 50%. It's already happening in England, I'm sure you know. And Germany and France and others are beginning to cut back on their subsidies for the so-called green energy because it's so expensive and it doesn't produce anything.
Now, Dr. Coffman, tell us what's the main reason they want to reduce our living standards? Why are they so keen to usher in this post-industrial revolution that they talk about?
I think it's because of control. They have to have a dumbed-down, impoverished civilization to be able to control it adequately. If we get a good education and we're prosperous, it really creates a nightmare for them to be able to control us. And as a consequence, that is a mechanism that they can use to not only get us more impoverished, but to dumb us down. They are using really nasty scare stories that have no truth at all in substance and validity. It is incredible how they have literally tried to use every excuse they can to justify the need for having all of these cap and trade schemes that they've come up with to control carbon, which does nothing more than controls energy, which controls or provides for our economy. Once they have control of that, and they're down to 80% reduction in our energy use, we will not have an economy. We'll be a third world nation here in the United States. And unless they can develop some sort of incredible battery storage capability, green energy can never, ever replace fossil fuel energy for both the expense as well as the type and power of energy that's produced. There's just no way that they can do it, because when the wind doesn't blow, windmills don't work, and when the sun doesn't shine, solar panels don't work. As simple as that. There's a lot of other reasons why this is not an efficient type of approach either. But the fact is, our president here in this country and in Europe, now that they're starting to back off, but for a long time, we're pushing very heavily this alternative energy that just doesn't work.
And of course, now we've got the EU trying to impose, well, it already is imposing carbon taxes on any flight that, you know, goes into European airspace. I mean, China's rejected that. What do you think of that move? Is that, you know, a backdoor carbon tax effort?
Oh, absolutely it is. I just don't think it's going to work. I think there's going to be, I think what's going to happen is it's going to hurt Europe more than it helps anything, and as a consequence, they're going to have to back off of that. But it is there now, so you have to deal with it, and it's just one more mechanism to try to basically put this cap on energy use into place.
And you briefly mentioned before reduction in living standards. Of course, that's also tied into population control in general. A couple of years ago, we had the UN come out in their blueprint, which got leaked, and basically admit that the global warming agenda is starting to be discredited. So now they're going to shift the alarmist propaganda over to the population bomb, which of course we heard back in the 70s with people like John P. Holdren. Do you see this big reduction of population that they're calling for, or is it more a case of, you know, they're going to push abortion and so-called fertility rights in the third world to keep the population down as it is? Because as we know, their own figures say that population will naturally level off at around 2050, and yet still, even as the host population of countries in Europe, like Russia and Italy, for example, declines, they're still obsessively pushing this population control agenda. Can you explain why they're still insistent on that, despite the fact that, as we know from their own figures, the population will eventually level out by the middle of the century?
Actually, I think it's going to happen sooner than that. It wasn't but about 10 years ago that they said it would reach its peak in 2010. It hasn't done that, obviously, but nonetheless, we are gradually slowing down. The fertility rate, as you just mentioned, in Europe is below 2.1, which is the replacement rate. It's way down in Russia and other parts of the world. And the only thing that is keeping this going are some of the third world nations. The question becomes, I believe, in this whole issue is, if you create wealth on an individual basis, which goes right back to the property rights discussion that we had earlier in the interview, because you cannot create wealth without property rights. Nonetheless, if you were to create wealth in these third world nations by giving them property rights, it's been shown very, very clearly that once a nation starts to get wealthy, it all of a sudden naturally begins to reduce its own replacement.
Hello and welcome to Infowars Nightly News with me, your host Paul Joseph Watson, on this Thursday, February 23rd edition. Now, I'm delighted to welcome to the show this evening Dr. Mike.
Plus some other things like women's rights and that type of thing. It really is a very comprehensive effort. It is soft law. It doesn't have any teeth or legal teeth to it. But they do have what is known as the Covenant on the Environment and Development in the wings. It's a treaty that will be a hard law. In other words, it will have penalties if you do not do it. So it as
up and resist it.
Well, your listeners are probably aware that it's a 40-chapter document that was brought out and signed by President Bush in 1992 at the Rio de Janeiro Summit, Earth Summit. And basically, those 40 chapters cover everything that humanity does as it interacts with the environment in some form or another.
Coffman, Ph.D., scientist, ecologist, involved in ecosystem research for both science and industry for over 20 years. Many of you, of course, will know him from Alex Jones' documentary Endgame, and his website is discerningtoday.org. Dr. Coffman, welcome to Infowars Nightly News.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be with you.
Well, let's get straight to the heart of the matter, which, of course, is Agenda 21. We've got the big 20th anniversary of Rio coming up. Tell the viewers about Agenda 21. How does it manifest itself today, and how will it affect our lives if we don't stand